What have I got here? Uh,
Classic.
that feels, yeah. We're very.
I feel like we had to put it in, you know.
We're very quickly leading into like bad radio territory, aren't we?
Yeah.
Whereas we've firmly established ourselves in bad podcast territory.
I think we're just in bad territory either way.
Hello and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the leftist Christian podcast that was comparing unfavourably Munter Isaac and Justin Welby before it was cool. I'm Ben Molyneux-Hetherington and I am joined by Adam Spiers. How you doing, Adam?
Yeah, all right. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. I feel like everyone's now on board with yay Munter Isaac and boo Justin Welby, but we were there in the new year, weren't we? As you know, we're really what's the word? Innovators in the sphere of disliking Justin Welby.
Although, interestingly, obviously, he has now met with Munter Isaac, who I think is a lot more diplomatic than we are, even though...
That's not a difficult task, in all fairness.
Well, to be fair, I mean, when he complained about Justin Welby not meeting with him, he was very direct with that, but probably in a way that was far more eloquent and... Just better than we would be able
less
to do.
Less sweary than us, all the usual.
That kind of thing.
I know it's a funny thing because I don't think Justin Welby's failure, as ever, is ideological. He just is trying to, he's scared of getting criticised for meeting someone, particularly because right now there's loads of stuff where people are being smeared over the Israel-Palestine stuff, and he's therefore really wary about getting involved in anything that might put him in a bad light. And then when it turned out that not meeting Munter Isaac was actually putting him in a worse light, he reversed course. I don't think he's really changed his mind on anything. I think it was just that the balance of forces changed, so he changed his approach.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. But I mean, in that respect, it is therefore deeply ideological.
Oh, sure.
And I think that's the thing with Justin Welby. I mean, he did... I don't know if I mentioned this in the discussion that we're about to have on this podcast, but Justin Welby did an interview with Tony Blair a year or two ago, where Tony Blair said that he was his political program was a deep skepticism of like basically all ideology, which is of course deeply ideological. And I think basically Welby agrees with that. I can't see any other way of interpreting his actions and the things that he says. And of course, one of the things that leads to is just inconsistency, because liberalism is a very inconsistent ideology. So, yeah, I'm not really surprised how this has played out.
And somehow he's still better than Rowan Williams to me.
To you.
Yeah, maybe just me alone, but, Justin Welby is, let this sink in, been better to LGBTQ plus people than Rowan Williams ever was as Archbishop of Canterbury. For a start, he's never stabbed one of his gay mates in the back publicly, so...
I mean, yes. But I think there are some people in Uganda who might have something to say about Justin Welby's inaction.
Oh, he's still awful, don't get me wrong, but...
I think that's worse, though. I think that's worse. When you're kind of like using colonialism as the excuse not to say you shouldn't jail or execute gay people. I do think that's worse than stabbing your gay friend in the back. Obviously that's terrible, but like...
For me, you're right, obviously. What I guess I'm trying to say is that my expectations of Justin Welby were zero from the start. We all knew what he was. Rowan Williams spent a few years pretending to be vaguely radical and abandoned it when he got a sniff of power. And therefore, maybe not on a practical impact on the world level, but on a purely personal level, I dislike him significantly more. And I like saying that because Church of England liberals love Rowan Williams still, despite everything. So it's just fun to point out what a complete arsehole he is.
I think I can't. Maybe this is the liberal in me talking.
There
I
we
don't
go.
know. Maybe I'm just
Go on,
still
Adam.
too liberal. But I
It's
can't.
not. I don't think it's the
go-
liberal. It's the Anglican in you speaking. It's worse.
Yeah. I think I just can't go quite that far on Justin Welby, on Rowan Williams. I think Welby and Williams have something in common, and that they're kind of weak. You know, like,
Yeah.
I think sometimes I think the difference is Rowan Williams, his core beliefs are better than Justin Welby's, but they both sort of end up in the same place through something akin to cowardice.
Yeah, there you go. You've softened me just saying controversial things to upset Anglicans. So today, rather than talking about our official ranking of Archbishops of Canterbury, we've actually already recorded an interview with Dr. Peter Shambrook, who is the author of a recent book called Policy of Deceit about British involvement in Palestine from kind of the First World War to the start of the Second World War. This is not the first time we've got a bit caught up in confusing time-based semantics. But yeah, we are going to skip now to the interview recorded with Peter Shambrook. So I guess time machine noises. Like, ooh. That's what was that? God. I was trying to do like
Wow.
when it goes all like watery on the screen and it like fades to a flashback. But I can't.
I don't even know what that noise was. I mean, I get what you were trying to do.
Yeah. But it was nowhere near. I've invented an entirely new sound. Anyway, here's the interview. We'll see you on the other side. We are joined today by Dr. Peter Shambrook. Hello and welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Peter is the author of the excellent book Policy of Deceit, Britain and Palestine, 1914 to 1939, available at all good book retailers as well as the evil one that you shouldn't buy it from. We are going to talk a little bit about the book and Britain's historic involvement in Palestine. But Peter, if we could start by just getting you to introduce yourself and kind of what led you to think about this topic.
Well, the topic in the book began to emerge about 7 years ago because I was asked by a group of friends. I just retired from school teaching, history school teaching, and I was asked by a group of friends to give a short talk, a 20-minute talk, about Britain's policies and promises that they made concerning the Middle East during the First World War. And this was partly because the conference was a kind of preparation conference towards the fact that in 2017, it would be the centenary of the issuing of the Balfour Declaration in 1917. So in order to prepare my talk about Britain and World War I and the Middle East, I went into the archives to the National Archives in Kew, just west of London, in order to look at a few of the original papers. And the more I looked, the more confused I became about exactly what Britain was doing. But my interest and background goes much further back than that, in the sense that when you read a history book, particularly about a contentious subject like this, you always wonder, what is the agenda, what is the ideology, what is the angle of this particular historian of the Middle East or historian of colonialism or whatever it is. Every writer has their story, which colours their perspective and colours their worldview. And in my case, there are three main influences that have coloured my writing. And implicitly, one can see those in a sense in the book, not explicitly, but implicitly between the lines. And one is my parents. I grew up in Stockport, near Manchester. We call Manchester a northern suburb. And my father was very English, quiet, reserved, solid, with an amazing World War II history of El Alamein and D-Day and many other events, about which he, like many of his generation, spoke with great reluctance. It was difficult to get him to talk about his war experiences. But when he died in 1977, he still had bits of German shrapnel in his leg and in his shoulder. My mother came from Republican Catholic Ireland. She was the daughter of a lighthouse keeper the west of Ireland. And she was big-hearted, bright, gracious, and let me say she was forensic when describing the history of the English in Ireland. So I grew up as an English Catholic lad near Manchester in the 1950s, trying to unsuccessfully absorb the joys and pains of two completely incompatible national narratives. So that was my start. And then my second influence has been my association with the program of moral rearmament, which is now called Initiatives of Change. And moral rearmament introduced me to the idea of global change based on personal change, and to the idea of the sort of Gandhian idea of listening to your inner voice daily for inspiration and direction. And that had a profound effect on me as a young lad from Stockport. And I spent 20 years in association in one shape or form with the program of moral rearmament. And moral rearmament introduced me to the Middle East, with visits made to Egypt and Sudan and Beirut and lots of other places, and deep friendships made. The third influence obviously has been the visits that I have made and the places I've been to over the years, such as Bergen-Belsen, Verdun, Berlin, Dresden, Arromanches in Normandy, many other places, Beirut during the Civil War, and Cork and Skibbereen in the southwest of Ireland. And these places and what happened there make you reflect on human nature and history and migration and colonialism and evil, as well as goodness in the heart of every man. So this is the background to my book on Britain and its policy in and around and about Palestine and the Middle East, in particular during the First World War and then up to the Second World War. So that gives some flavour of where I'm coming from.
I think it's really helpful. Before we started, we were just talking about this, but that recognition that I think you said about every writer has their own story, and that actually to get that sense of where you're coming from, where your ideas have been formed, and I'm particularly interested in that link you're implicitly drawing between being someone with an Irish parent and an English parent, those two different national stories. I think we might pick that theme back up again.
Yeah.
So we wanted to talk through a little bit of the history of the British involvement in Palestine. And I think it's an interesting thing where I think for a lot of people, this is a really unknown history, particularly for, I think, younger people who are less aware of some of the historical roots of what's going on here. But to set the scene, you've got Palestine being ruled over by the Ottoman Empire, going into the First World War, and the Ottoman Empire obviously are part of the Central Powers, and Britain are part of the Allies. And so what is it that kind of makes Britain first get involved in talking to particularly the leaders of Palestine?
Everything that happened during this period, you have to look at it from the point of view of the British decision makers. Everything, all the decisions they made, all the promises they made during the First World War was basically to win the war, right? To win the war. That was the fundamental thing. Everything else was secondary. Gaining a strategic edge over your enemies was the key thing. Now, of course, the world was very different then to what it is today. In 1914, when war broke out in August 1914, Britain was still the major power in the world. We had our rivals, the French and the Russians and the Germans and the Austrians, and of course the Americans were, in terms of power, and the Germans were close on our heels. But still, Britain was still if not the major power in the world, with our lines of communication and our empire stretched right across the world. And in particular, as far as the Middle East is concerned, we had control, we were in control of Egypt and in control of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was the artery. It was the communications artery vital to our solidity as an empire, with India and a massive army in India, and then, of course, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, etc. The Middle East was a kind of stepping stone. And when the Ottomans tipped over, so to speak, and joined the Central Powers in November 1914, when they did that, then the British looked at the map. And you have to understand, everybody, all the decision makers in Paris, in London, in St. Petersburg, in Berlin, that's what it was. Now, on the podcast, we can't look at maps, but mentally, if one is going to really understand the decision-making process, military and diplomatic and political, of these people, one has to look at a map. I suppose a bit like trying to understand, what are the Americans and the British and the Israelis and everybody else doing in the Middle East, and where do the Houthis come in? And what's this gap between Iran and Saudi Arabia, this Straits of Hormuz, et cetera, et cetera. So maps were very important. And all the War Office in London and the High Commissioner in Egypt, in Cairo, they all had maps in front of them. So when the Ottomans, which is now Turkey, but it was a bit more than Turkey still, the Ottoman Empire in 1914, when they decided to join the Central Powers, they became our enemies. And we had to deal with them. If we were going to win the war, we had to defeat the Ottomans as well as the Germans and the Austrians and so on. The next big sort of issue to deal with and to be aware of is that from the 17th century onwards, pretty much, great powers, part of their normal diplomatic discourse was they would bargain with other great powers in terms of trading others' territories, potential enemies' territories and things like this. And it was a transactional world, just as it is today. Okay, a transactional world. So just to give you an example, the Europeans, as far as Africa were concerned, the European powers in the 1870s, 1878, got together among themselves and they divided what was not yet colonized of Africa into spheres of influence and interest, what they call the scramble for Africa. If you go closer to the First World War, in 1904, we had what we British called the Entente Cordiale, where we and the French warmed up our relations after nearly 150, 200 years of enmity from Napoleonic times. But that, in reality, not publicly, but privately, that was a colonial trade-off. In the Entente Cordiale, we British government, we agreed that the French could have a free hand in Morocco, and the French agreed that we could have a free hand in Egypt. A few years later, in 1907, we made this interesting agreement with the Russian royal Tsarist Romanov family government. We divided Persia, what later became called Iran, into 3 zones between us. Okay, the Persians didn't have any involvement in any of this. It was an agreement between ourselves and the Russians. And the 3 zones in Iran were the northern part of Iran would be Russian territory, but in the southeast of Iran, which was closer to the Indian British Empire, would be under British control, and there'd be a sort of neutral zone of Persia in between, where neither the Brits nor the Russians would interfere with each other. So trading each other's territories and carving up other people's potential enemies and things like this was standard great power secret diplomacy. So it is not surprising that when the First World War arrived or was about to break out, because it was a bit of a surprise for most, pretty well everybody, unlike the Second World War, the British and the other great powers started to make promises to each other and to negotiate with each other. So concerning Palestine and the Middle East, when the war started, the British first made an agreement with their French allies and their Russian allies. And the agreement was this. The British and the French said, you Russians, you can have what you've always wanted, which is Constantinople and the Straits. And the French were given, or the Russians and the British said, you French, you can have the whole of Syria. And the British said to the Russians and to the French, okay, you can have all these guys, but we British, we keep our options open and we will claim any part of the Ottoman territory according to how the chips fall at the end of hostilities. So as far as Palestine is concerned, basically, we promised Palestine to the French in the spring of 1915, just when there was a massive stalemate in the trenches getting going, because remember the war had started in August 1914. Then the stalemate continued and hundreds of thousands of British and French and German troops were being slaughtered and so on. It was a stalemate. And Gallipoli happened, and Gallipoli was a disaster trying to defeat the Ottoman Empire. So the British then turned to the Arabs. If you look on the map, you had this Arab minority under the Ottomans in the Hejaz, running northwards up towards Palestine and Lebanon and Syria and up towards Turkey. And then around the Fertile Crescent, there were Arabs all the way through to Iraq, further in the east, which was still part of the Ottoman Empire. So basically, the British tried to encourage the Sharif of Mecca, who was the leading religious authoritarian or authority figure in the Islamic world, to rebel against their Ottoman masters. There was a big Arab minority within the Ottoman Empire in that region. And the whole idea was, what could the British offer? What could the British offer the Arabs in return? And so the British said to the Sharif of Mecca, if you commit treason and you rebel against the Ottoman troops and you rise up against the Ottoman troops and you cause them problems in your region, we will, when at the end of the war, when we've defeated the Ottoman Empire, we will support an extensive independent Arab state over the whole, pretty much 90% of the whole of what is now Saudi Arabia and parts of Iraq and what is now Palestine, Jordan, Israel, etc. So in October 1915, that's what we promised the Sharif of Mecca. And he and his troops in Mecca and in the Hejaz, in the western part of Saudi Arabia, what is now Saudi Arabia, they did rebel against the Ottoman troops in June 1916. And that's when, of course, you have then enter Lawrence of Arabia and various other British intelligence officers and British military support for the Sharif's rebellion. Soon after that, of course, in May 1916, you ended up with the British and the French looking at the map, and you had the Sykes-Picot Agreement where, unbeknown to the Arabs, unbeknown to the Sharif, the British and the French sat together in London, namely Sir Mark Sykes and George Picot came over from Paris, and they looked at a map. To cut a long story short, they divided up the Middle East, as is well known, into spheres of French and British influence and control. The one area that Sykes and Picot could not agree on in terms of French or British control was this little bit of area called Palestine, or Palestine region, and so they marked that literally in a different color on the map, because they were both squabbling over who would have control of Palestine for a whole variety of reasons. That was 1916, and then around that time, in the summer of 1916, British officials started to negotiate in London with the Zionist organization, particularly with a man called Chaim Weizmann, who was an amazing lobbyist for the Zionist organization. And after 18 months of intense negotiations, the British cabinet eventually issued a letter signed by Arthur Balfour, the Foreign Secretary at the time. And this letter stated that the British government would support the establishment of a national homeland for the Jewish people after the war in Palestine. So Palestine was promised by the British to the French. It was then promised by the British to Sharif Hussein of Mecca. The French and the British then decided among themselves it'll be an international administration in Palestine after the war. And then a year later, you had the Palestine region being promised to the global Jewish community, the World Zionist Organization. And then just to finish off the deal, at the end of the war, the British and French governments issued a military declaration, a public declaration, which was publicized throughout the Middle East, including Palestine. And this declaration stated specifically that the war aims of the Allies, the British and the French, was to establish in the Middle East region governments and institutions which would reflect the will of the local populations. And just to say, that was a complete lie on their part. They had their reasons for doing it. I can explain it later if you like. So there was a whole series of promises, and Palestine, the Palestine region, was definitely promised twice, if not 3 times, to various groups during the First World War.
Something that I thought really comes through in the book is the extent to which actually the British government don't seem massively interested in who is running Palestine in and of itself. It's more about what they can get out of promising it, right? It's actually about serving other interests rather than the place itself.
Yeah, and what they can prevent as well.
Yeah.
Who they can prevent having control and so on.
There's a really interesting bit in the Second World War where basically everything they do is kind of based around they upset the Zionist organizations because they don't push ahead as much because they're we just need to focus on keeping Egypt. That's all that matters to us. We'll do whatever we can to keep everything under control in Palestine because Egypt's the important thing. There's an interesting point where someone basically is quoted in your book. I thought it was really fascinating quote saying, this is what happens. In the middle of a war, you make a bunch of promises, and at the end of the war, you decide which ones you're going to keep. I'm obviously paraphrasing that there, but that's essentially what it came down to.
That is the vocabulary of the conqueror. That is the vocabulary of the powerful, not the powerless.
And it's something as well, isn't it, that we talk a lot these days about living in a post-truth society, and Trump in particular has created alternative facts and all the rest of it. But this has always been the way. Yes, okay, we talk about how we're very polarized politically at the moment, particularly in this country and in the Anglosphere, perhaps. Arguably, actually, with the rise of more sort of right-wing parties across Europe, maybe more broadly as well. But actually, politicians, those in power, have always lied, have always fairly constantly lied. That's not new. And that was something else that I was really thinking about a lot as I was reading this.
Yes, I mean, one of the main features of great power diplomacy has always been hidden agendas, whether it's, George Bush, mission accomplished, and spreading democracy around the Middle East, and all that sort of hypocritical blather, when the main reason, of course, is the maintenance of oil supplies. We all know that. But hidden agendas have always been a part and parcel of great power diplomacy. And sometimes it is appropriate for a great power not to tell the whole truth immediately. I must say, just to give a little plug, there's a lovely, very interesting, really interesting short book by a Professor Mearsheimer, who's a professor of political science in Chicago. He's written a number of books. He's a big sort of thinker in political science, and he's written a small book, one of his many books, but he's written a small book called Why Leaders Lie. And he takes various examples in recent history over the last 100 years or so. Anyway, that is a really interesting book. But as far as Palestine were concerned, basically, after the war, for their own reasons, the British reneged on their promise to the Arabs, and they maintained their promise to the global Jewish community. And in terms of hidden agendas, basically the British hid their intentions consistently from the Arab population in Palestine. For instance, Balfour in Parliament about 1922, when he said that the political rights of the Palestinians are absolutely fully safeguarded. And of course, they weren't. Churchill said that the British government was going to introduce some forms of self-government in Palestine. But when you actually read the documents, that was an absolute lie. The Duke of Devonshire, who became the colonial secretary in 1923, he said in the House of Lords, the British government would never introduce policies that would be against the political or economic wishes of the Palestinian people. The British High Commissioner in Palestine, the first British High Commissioner, Sir Herbert Samuel, who was a British Zionist figure and the British government's representative in Palestine for the first 5 years from 1920 to 1925, he insisted that he was impartial and he was doing the best thing for the Palestinian people, and there would be some development of self-government and things like this. And it was an absolute lie, because what they were saying among themselves from the records is quite clear. If you really want to understand British policy in Palestine for the first 20 years or so, from 1918 through to 1939, the truth about British intentions and British policy is this. And this was revealed in a speech in 2011 by a man called Sir Martin Gilbert. Sir Martin Gilbert was right at the heart of the British establishment for decades. He was Churchill's official biographer. He wrote 7 or 8 volumes from Churchill's papers. He was a part of the Chilcot Commission, etc., etc. He wrote about 80 books, massive books on the Holocaust, and he had a home in Jerusalem, and he used to visit Jerusalem every year and give a lecture, a university lecture, a sort of distinguished lecture. In 2011, he gave this lecture, and this was Ben Gurion University. It was a Jewish audience, and it was on video. It's on YouTube. You can watch it. And in this lecture, at one point, he lapsed into balance, so to speak. And this is what he said, and I quote, he said, "The centerpiece of British mandatory policy was the withholding of representative institutions for as long as there was in Palestine an Arab majority." Okay, that was the fundamental real intention of British policy, government policy, from 1918 through to 1948, to the whole business of the establishment of the state of Israel and the catastrophe, the Nakba and everything else. But at the same time, the British were also constantly saying publicly to the Palestinians, your rights are protected. But in fact, the Zionist government and the Zionist administration of Lloyd George in 1920, they set up this kind of crown colony government administration which passed laws arbitrarily, and there was absolutely no recognition of Palestinian rights, or that the Palestinians had any potential national rights.
Yeah, and I think it's quite an interesting, there's this real effort to deny that a promise was ever made to the Sharif of Mecca, right? And that goes on for many years, using some, what in your book you make clear are fairly flimsy arguments against it, but never wanting to just come outright and say, do you know what, we're not following through on the promise. How much of that do you think was that real politic of trying to keep the Arab population happy, and how much of that do you think was about the British wanting to uphold the reputation for fair dealing and not look like they were being deceitful? How much do you think each of those was a factor?
I don't think they were particularly interested in keeping the Arabs or the Palestinians happy. They wanted to keep them quiescent. They wanted the Arab population in Palestine to remain relatively peaceful. They wanted stability. The British didn't want to have to put in more troops than necessary, because troops cost money. And in parliaments, there would always be yearly discussions about how much the army in different parts of the empire were costing. And the Foreign Office always wanted to keep the number of troops in Palestine down to a minimum, and the cost down to a minimum. But once the administration in Palestine the British administration in Palestine had been established by Sir Herbert Samuel and his colleagues, in a sense, the die was cast. You have to think of the empire as a giant oil tanker. So once it had left port, it is not going to change direction easily once it sets its goal. And the goal of the Palestine administration was to specifically authorize Jewish immigration and to refuse to recognize any sort of national Palestinian Arab entity. So what the administration did, basically, when Sir Herbert Samuel came into power and was responsible for Palestine for the first 5 years of the civilian administration from 1920 to 1925, they passed laws they passed laws which recognized the local Jewish National Assembly as a national assembly. They specifically denied recognizing the Arab executive in Palestine as being illegal. They passed laws authorizing a quota of Jewish immigrants every year, and they opened the land registration system for foreigners to buy land, which enabled the global Jewish community to begin to buy little bits of land in Palestine itself. And the British then made the Hebrew language a third official language alongside Arabic and English. At that time, at the end of the war, in 1918, at the end of the war, the percentage of the population in Palestine who spoke Hebrew as their natural mother tongue was 2%. 2%. Okay. So the Palestinians wanted to be recognized as the majority. They wanted the development of some sort of local parliament and institutions. And you have to understand the context. After the First World War, the great powers, of course, wanted to keep their grip on the Middle East as well as everywhere else in their empire, Africa and Australia and everywhere else. But also there was a certain element with the development of the fledgling League of Nations. There was a kind of stirring among the empires of nationalism among small nations, and also what you might call stirrings for the desire for self-government within the empire. So 1920, of course, you have to remember Lord George had a civil war in Ireland on his hand, which resulted in self-government for most but not all of Ireland by 1921. Not entirely out of the empire, but sort of en route with a free state in Ireland. And you also had stirrings in places like India as well, with Gandhiji and so on. And that got going then in the 30s, in the beginning of the 30s in India. But the Palestinian, the educated, the sort of minority of what you might call Western educated, very politically aware Palestinians in Palestine, in Jerusalem and so on, after the First World War, they looked around. They could see that the British and the French had basically kept control of Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, Egypt, etc. The French were still solidly in North Africa, in Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and so on. But in Egypt, you had a local parliament. In Jordan, you had a local parliament. You had a king, but he had a sort of constitutional monarchy. They were under the British. But the Palestinians looked around and they could see in these various places around them in the Middle East, not in Saudi Arabia, it was something else, but basically in the places where the British and the French still had control, there were growing the embryos of national governments. And the British and the French were allowing the embryos of national governments to develop, although they were using a lot of strategies to keep full control of them at the time. The British did not allow one iota of an embryo of a Palestinian national movement to develop. That is the key thing. And so there were disturbances about this in 1920. There were bigger disturbances in 1921. And then things were more or less quiet until 1929. And then there were big disturbances in 1929. And then finally, after 15 years for the Palestinians, they sent delegations to London, multilingual delegations to London. These were not people who were shepherds from the fields. These were lawyers, Sorbonne-trained lawyers and other people, okay? But they got nowhere with the British Foreign Office. So they had petitions, they had demonstrations, and eventually, when the British absolutely refused to countenance no constitutional reform whatsoever, the lid came off the dustbin, so to speak, in 1936, and there was a major Arab-Palestinian revolt, which went on for 3 years, and which was brutally suppressed by the British.
So that was the first part of our interview. We will get on to the second part in a moment. But before we do that, we are going to take a little break to talk about our Saint of the Week this week.
Saint of the Week.
Our saint of the week this week is Henry Gunter. Henry Gunter was born in Jamaica in 1920. And obviously, at that point in time, Jamaica was not an independent country. It was part of the British Empire. So he was kind of born as a British... It's not citizen, is it? They're not... What is the term?
Subject.
Subject. Thank you. I get confused with all this imperial nonsense. But yeah, and he ended up moving to America, having trained as an accountant and lived there for a number of years. He actually was quite shocked to find segregation there because Jamaica was not a segregated country. But while he was there, he did a bunch of union work and was a writer in kind of newspapers and that sort of thing. And he spent some time with the Communist Party USA, who were involved in some of the race equality stuff that was going on. And he became increasingly involved in both trade union stuff and civil rights stuff in America. And at one point, he got back to Jamaica, and the FBI won't let him back to America. It's never made clear exactly why not. Probably something, a mix of his union activities, his civil rights work, and potentially a newspaper called The Jamaican Worker that he was publishing that had some fairly radical ideas in this. So he spent a bit of time in Jamaica doing some political work there, but he found work really hard to find and ended up coming across to Britain and landed in Birmingham. He actually, despite the fact he was an accountant, he ended up working in brass rolling and tool cutting and machine operating. So kind of, yeah, all that sort of stuff. He was, in fact, the first black delegate to the Birmingham Trades Council. He was really heavily involved in Trades Union Congress and all sorts of this stuff. And he wrote a kind of short book or long pamphlet called A Man's a Man, A Study of Colour Bar in Birmingham and an Answer. Which was actually really important in the kind of British civil rights struggle. It became a really key text in that. And yeah, he was really involved in kind of pushing against racial segregation that was kind of de facto in place in Birmingham and really central within that. He was mates with Paul Robeson, which is pretty cool, and a few other kind of famous civil rights leaders and people. He moved to Kent briefly, and then when they retired, went back to Birmingham, and he was a prominent member of a Methodist church in Birmingham. As we've discussed before, with these kind of figures where they have some presence, you know, people that are famous enough to have stuff written about them, but not full biography books or anything like that, it's often really hard to find much about their faith. But he was certainly a practicing Methodist. When he died, the Methodist minister paid tribute to him and talked about knowing him, and both about how he was brilliant as an activist and a very principled man, but also how he was very widely read and a really interesting person to speak to. And yeah, just a really brilliant person. He passed away in 2007, so not that long ago. He continued to work in trade unions and kind of for civil rights and equality, racial equality, but kind of as he grew older, he was less involved, but that he was less of a prominent figure. But yeah, someone who was really heavily involved. You know, that history of fighting the colour bar in Birmingham is a really fascinating one. And, you know, black activism in the UK is so heavily focused around the work that was being done in Birmingham in that era. And he's a really central figure in that, as well as being, you know, a practicing Methodist. So that is your saint of the week for this week, Henry Gunter.
Very nice. I've been looking him up, and I know the church where he was a member for a while. I've not visited there, I don't think, but I've certainly walked past it a few times. Giving away that I live in Birmingham.
Yeah. I think that's been mentioned a few times.
Yeah. Birmingham's a big place. Come and find me, fascists, you know?
Yeah. I mean, also, you've spoken about, you've definitely mentioned that you're as well, so...
Look, most fascists are not bright enough, Ben, to know that you can go and look back at previous episodes. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, guys. I live at Birmingham. Yeah.
Yeah, you've given away before that you live at... So it's now...
See, I was going to just work in the bleep in the edit, but now it's not going to be as funny because you've already bleeped here. I don't know what to do with it now. Maybe it'll be full of bleeps.
Yeah, just bleep the whole thing. 2 minutes of bleep, then it's perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, it actually he contributes to the church magazine as well, which I think is really great, given that he's
radical.
Well, given that his publishing and writing basically made the FBI not let him back in America, to end up being a church magazine writer is really wonderful. Like, that's such a Anyway, that was our saint of the week for this week. We will now return back to the second part of our interview with Peter Shambrook. So, stay tuned for that.
Say those time machine noises again, Ben.
It's not, no, it's not even. I'm just doing some sort of like shit arpeggio, aren't I? Like,
I don't know. Sure.
Yeah, that's 6 months of a degree that had the word worship in its title. I've learned a lot about music in that.
One of the things we'll often hear from very Zionist voices these days is this idea, well, Palestine has never existed as an independent state. And what I wanted to ask you was, how was that kind of being formed, that sort of nationalism in Palestine? How should we view that? Because clearly there was some kind of Palestinian identity. How long had that been forming, and what did that look like?
If you put yourself in the shoes of the Ottomans and the people of the Middle East during the First World War, the Palestine region was a geographical region. It was not a specific Ottoman administrative entity. In some ways, a bit like the Lake District in our parlance. Geographical, we all know pretty much, where it starts, where it ends, more or less, but not a political entity. Palestine was a bit the same. Therefore, when the British came in, the Palestinians, having been promised by the British that Syria and this whole area would be an independent Arab state, they were still thinking of themselves pretty much as southern Syrians. So when the British drew the political lines and the Palestine Mandate became a political entity, so Palestine became a political entity for the first time in international law when the mandates were ratified by the League of Nations, 24th of July, 1922. Okay, that's when Palestine ceased being occupied Ottoman territory, pretty much, and became a political entity. The Palestinians, in a sense, moving from wanting self-government as an Arab Syrian, mostly Syrian identity, had to rethink their whole program because they were now being sat upon, so to speak, by not the Turks, but by the British. The thing I would say to remember is that most nationalisms are a reaction to something else. Our nationalism, our development as a country, specifically England, Elizabethan England, was a reaction to the Spanish threat, wanting to make us Catholic again. And then we had the Armada in 1588 and so on and so forth. So I would say there were antecedents of Palestinian nationalism, even at the end of the 19th century, for a whole variety of reasons. But it crystallized following the First World War as a reaction to what I would call Zionist designs on Palestine, because the Zionists were very clear that they wanted the whole of Palestine as a Jewish state. And those educated Palestinians, some of whom learned Hebrew and so on, they could hear and see what the Zionists were saying publicly. And Weizmann, when Weizmann arrived in Palestine in March 1918, he reassured the Palestinian leadership. The mayor of Jerusalem was there and the Mufti, and they had a big meeting and a dinner arranged by the British. And he said specifically that we Zionists, we are not intending to in any way try and develop political control of Palestine. At the same time, to his own followers, for a variety of reasons, they were clearly talking themselves about transferring the Arabs out of Palestine and creating a Jewish state, independent Jewish state. And the Palestinians knew this. So I'd say Palestinian nationalism developed partly as a reaction to Zionist designs during the 1920s, although Palestinian nationalism, many historians will take it further back to before the First World War and so on and so forth. But the main thing to remember is that it's not unusual for nationalism and national entities to grow out of it, a reaction to, in particular, a stronger group who want to either treat them badly or might treat them badly or have already treated them badly. If you look at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, what Wilson and and Clemenceau and Lord George had to deal with in terms of Central Europe, and the clamouring of the Hungarians and the Czechs and the Slovaks and all these other groups who were under the Austrians. They all wanted their own national states, and some of them got them and some of them didn't get them. And the Kurds, for instance, didn't get them, etc., etc. But the British were very clear and very specific that they had decided they were going to have a pro-Zionist Jewish immigration policy, and they were not going to allow any constitutional development at all. So they operated on the basis, from the beginning, the British operated on the basis that there were two national entities in Palestine. So there wasn't just the Arab entity, but there was the Jewish entity. And of course, you have to understand in Palestine as a region, and that whole region has been part of the Islamic Arab civilization, culturally and in terms of language, for 1,300 years, apart from the Crusades, 12th and 13th century Crusades interlude. And so up to the First World War, the majority of Jews, which was a very small majority because there were only 7 or 8% of the population, indigenous Jews in Palestine, they were Arabic speaking, had Arabic culture, Arabic food, their language was Arabic, their religion was Jewish, that was their religion, and they were a very religious small minority, one of many other minorities in Palestine. Palestine was full of minorities for all historical reasons. So they were not Europeans. They didn't see themselves as being separate or foreigners, and they were not considered to be foreigners by the majority Palestinian Arab population. The majority of whom are Muslim, of course, but there are historically around 10%, used to be anyway, 10% of Arab Palestinians were Christian and so on. And that goes back to the time of Christ. They've been there for 2,000 years. Context is the great thing here. You have to understand context if you're going to understand the mindsets and the decisions that the decision makers were making. It was in the 1880s that Russian and Polish and Ukrainian and Romanian and other Jewish refugees began to trickle into Palestine as a result of the pogroms in Russia. And up to the First World War, from the 1880s up to the First World War, those Jewish immigrants, the vast majority of them headed to America. They didn't head to Palestine. They headed to America. They came through Britain. Some of them stayed in Britain, but most of them headed to America. It was only after the First World War that they really started to arrive in larger numbers in Palestine. But the indigenous Jewish population of Palestine were not agricultural. They were mostly in the four towns. Jerusalem, Safad, Tiberias, and Hebron. The Palestinian Arabs, because it was quite an agricultural focused sort of society still, they were the people farming in the hills and valleys of Palestine.
So how much of that early phase of Zionist settlement of Palestine would have been, if not a full-on nationalist movement, would have had designs on some sort of Jewish nationalism in Palestine?
Some of the settlers who came from Russia from the 1880s onwards did settle in kind of socialist communes, kibbutzes and moshavim and things like this. But the majority headed into the towns. So there were a number of very pioneering small settlements, particularly in the north of Palestine. But in terms of the intentions of the British and the intentions of the Zionist organization in London, they intended to create a Jewish state in Palestine. And that intention was there. That intention was there from the First World War. It's very clear from the Colonial Office records. That was there. But they needed to find, after the First World War, the Zionists and the British needed to find some sort of what we call a circumlocution. They needed to find a word which everybody in the know, in the loop, would understand what they were intending. But for political international law consumption and the public, they couldn't say it out aloud. I mean, the fact is, in the atmosphere of self-determination for young nations after the war, with the Paris Peace Conference and everything, when self-determination was kind of in the air but not really accepted by the great powers, but they went along with it. The Zionist leadership and high advicemen, they knew they could not immediately call for a Jewish state in Palestine, because Palestine was, in terms of land ownership, Palestine was 97 or 98% owned by Arab landowners and the Arab civilization, Arab people, a lot of them absentee landowners. But if you want to have a state, you need land and you need people, okay? And in Palestine, after the war, the Jewish community had 2 or 3% of the land, and they had 7 or 8% of the population, heading for 10% with the new immigrants from Russia and places. Even they could not call for a Jewish sovereign state in Palestine at the Paris Peace Conference on that basis. So they needed a stepping stone. They needed the protection of a great power and the administration of a great power to begin to allow them to buy land and put more people in if they were ever going to be able to create a state. And during the First World War, the Zionist organization basically turned to the British because they realized they could see which way the wind was blowing, and they banked on the British. They were in London, and they played the game in terms of hoping that the British would enter Palestine and provide them with the political and military and diplomatic cover and the sort of bayonets, so to speak, which would enable Jewish immigration and the creation of a Jewish state. And that's what eventually worked out. But some historians say that the British didn't offer the Jewish community a state in 1920. It was just a homeland. But in fact, when you look at all the records, it's absolutely clear that they did offer a Jewish state, a potential eventual Jewish state, and they provided all the support after the war to enable that to happen up to 1939. And then circumstances changed in 1939 for a whole variety of reasons. Then basically we, having betrayed the Arabs for 20 years, we then massively betrayed global Jewish community from 1939 onwards. But that's another story.
We're probably coming to the end of time here, but I just wanted to finish to talk very quickly about where we're at now and the kind of reality moving forward and the way this story you're telling plays into it. I was a bit struck by, I can't remember which document it is, but one of the documents that kind of talks to some of the excuses the British have for the backtracking on promises you refer to as a dodgy dossier, which is obviously, a bit of a call forward to some of the things that happened later. But it did make me think actually about the way that kind of policy of obfuscating things and burying it under layers of untruths and nonsense, and how effective that has actually been. And also, I really like to open the book with a quote from James Baldwin that is, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." So I guess, do you think the kind of future of what happens next in Palestine and with everything that's going on right now, do you think it need to be looking at that past to understand the roots and be able to solve it? And do you think that is something that is starting to happen with the increased attention that's going on right now? Is that kind of history finally being understood a bit better again?
I'm not sure it's being understood any better again, so to speak. I think it would be helpful. It is always helpful, I think, if a great power acknowledges its mistakes in the past. If you read, for instance, Jonathan Powell's book, Talking to Terrorists, and all the various Track 2 initiatives for peace building and for resolving massive conflicts. And he has decades of experience of all of this, in particular with his part as Blair's point man for a decade on the peace process in Northern Ireland. He talks about trust building. One of the key things is trust building. If you go around the Middle East, why should anybody trust what the British and the French, or the British and the Americans and others, the Western powers, are saying, when their words say one thing and their actions prove another? So Biden is currently feeding and killing Palestinians. That's what he's doing. So I think as far as we British are concerned, the past is not past. I think we need to start with ourselves. And I think we British have a legacy of a need to be trusted again. We are not trusted. So I think we ought to acknowledge our double dealing, particularly on this issue, but on lots of other issues concerning Israel and Palestine. I think it would be helpful. I'm not saying it would be a great stepping stone to resolving the conflicts or anything like that. I'm not naive. I've been involved for too long for that. But I think as a start, it would be helpful for us British to acknowledge. The other thing is that we British have never acknowledged one iota of responsibility for what happened, particularly in 1948, which is another whole story. We have never acknowledged, we just washed our hands and we left them to it. We set up the conflict and then they had the conflict and we left them to it. And there's been a huge legacy of suffering and hate and humiliation and exile and dispossession and everything ever since, which continues to this day. So I think a British acknowledgement, an honest acknowledgement of our history would be helpful. I remember when I was in Belfast a few years ago, my Irish friend said to me, Peter, he said, we don't want a cheap apology. Apologies by politicians can be just a public relations exercise. That is not the issue. What we really want is a change in policy. We would like you to be honest about your history, and have a real change in policy and accountability. And I think it's the same in the Middle East. I think it would be very healthy and trust building if the British, and not just the British, but the Americans as well, and others who were and are involved in this whole awful nightmare, are honest about not just their past policies and past intentions, but also about their present. So the only other thing I would mention is, in terms of solving this sort of intractable issue, 100-year-old intractable issue, parity of esteem is really vital. In my view, there will be absolutely no solution to this until all parties, including the so-called terrorists, are involved around the table and there is parity of esteem. At the moment, for instance, Israel's rhetoric is that of the slave master. There is no parity of esteem. And what we're witnessing at the moment is not so much a conventional war. It's not a conventional war. In my view, as a historian, it is a colonial-style ethnic cleansing operation. And we, the British government, and as an Englishman, I'm speaking now, as far as the British government is concerned, I believe my government, our government, is currently complicit in collective punishment and ethnic cleansing, in war crimes. We are complicit in international law. If you support another government in ethnic cleansing, you are in international law equally complicit and equally guilty. And I think the reckoning will come eventually. Parity of esteem and acknowledgement of our own history, past and present, would be what I would recommend.
Thank you for joining us, Peter. That was really fascinating. I do want to recommend to all our listeners the book, which is, really fascinating and insightful. And as you've just established, it's not just a book about what has happened, but actually the roots of what is happening now. And it is a really well done book, well researched, but also easy to read. Definitely not one where you have to pause for a thesaurus or a dictionary every 10 seconds.
Which is really nice, actually, because it is an academic book, but it's really readable as well, and that makes a nice change from a lot of...
Yes, I can write are worth their weight in gold, I think. So, I do really recommend the book. And thank you very much for joining us today. That's been really insightful, so thank you.
Well, it's lovely to talk with you. Lovely to talk with you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Bread and Rosaries. It was a pleasure to interview Peter, and I do recommend Policy of Deceit. We will link it in the notes. Peter also asked us to point people towards the Balfour Project, which is an organisation which he's been involved in for a number of years, which is basically about educating people particularly about the history of British involvement in Palestine and in the Middle East more generally. There's plenty of information there, trying to give people the basic historical facts to think through, because as we touched on the interview, it's actually not a topic that people are aware of the British involvement of, I think, to a great extent. So, yeah. And while Adam's cat shoves its bum into a microphone, which I'm now watching on the video, Adam, where in the world can people find you?
You can find me most places at CommieXIAN. And we should probably also mention that Peter asked us to link to a review of the book in the Church Times. The cat is bumping the microphone again. I'm sorry if you can hear that coming through. Not a lot I can do. I don't know what he wants. Yeah, so we'll link that in the show notes as well.
And Richard Parker, what have you got to say?
He has very little to say other than feed me.
He did look at the camera though when I asked, so you know.
Yeah. Well, I've got earphones in, so I don't think he heard anything, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you very much for listening. As always, if you've got anything you want to feed back to us, Pete also said that if people have questions or anything they want to feed back to him, we could pass it over to him. So if you want to send nice stuff or, you know, polite inquiries, if it's abuse, we don't want to send it to him because that just seems mean. But, you know, we're happy to pass on stuff to Peter. And if you want to feed back to us at all or got any questions, suggestions, all the rest of it, breadandrosaries@gmail.com. All our kind of contact stuff's on breadandrosaries.com. You can find a Patreon. You can find a shop. You can find other stuff on that website. But I don't run the website, so I don't really know. I just trust Adam isn't going to put anything awful on there.
I mean, I'm not going to put anything awful on there, although I haven't updated it for a while, and there are definitely things that need to go on there.
So I would suggest you regularly check breadandrosaries.com and see if anything new's on there. So yeah, thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next time. Cheers.